The need to reform the
UN Security Council.
Expansion of the membership of the Security Council.
Hi, welcome to another episode of The Take. World leaders traveled to New York in September to participate in the 77th United Nations General Assembly. And in the general debate, there were some interesting speeches by world leaders. As you know, in the Security Council, Africa does not have permanent representation.
Mr. President, we have been speaking for a long time about the reform of this institution and about the recognition that there were only a quarter of the states that now exist when this institution was formed. Earlier this week, President Biden spoke of the need to reform the Security Council. We call and echo for that, but we go further, because we believe that a Security Council that retains the power of veto in the hands of a few will still lead us to war, as we have seen this year. And therefore, the reform must not simply be in its composition, but also be in the removal of that veto. We also believe that the recognition of the G7 countries and the G20 countries as the informal subcommittee of governance of this world, if it is to be fair, must recognize that no longer can we accept that persons call year after year after year for the inclusion of the people of Africa and African descent to be included in the G7 and G20. For how can a world have at its core a subcommittee that excludes more than 1.4, 1.5 billion people of the world and expect it to reflect fairness and transparency in its decision-making? We ask that the determination be made by those countries who must understand that if we are to move from possibilities to realities, we must embrace a transparent framework that allows our people who are losing faith in their institutions and in the governance of this world to understand that fairness means something. That fairness means the ability for all to have a voice, and that we can't only speak to it within the corridors of democracy within the nation state, but it will only mean something when it also is reflected in our international community. And if I perhaps have one simple theme today, it is that that fairness and that togetherness is what is needed to bring about peace, love, and prosperity in this world. And no, this is not romanticism. These are hard realities that simply require decisions.
Leave no one behind. These four words are the promise at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is the principle this UN body committed to. But today, over 3.5 years after that commitment was made, smaller nations and younger democracies around the world already feel like this is an empty promise. We all know that pandemics are a global problem that will never be solved unless all nations solve it together. Yet in the rollout of vaccines and application of travel restriction, we have been left behind. We all know that regional insecurity is a global problem that will never be solved unless all nations solve it together. Yet, in the participation of the UN Security Council decisions that affect us, we have been left behind.
It is also for this reason that many nations, especially from the global south, now advocate for the democratization of the global governance and a reimagined multilateralism that is inclusive and works for the good of all. Kenya stands ready to work with other nations to achieve the Pan-Africanization of multilateralism and a more just and inclusive system of global governance. It is important to reflect on these matters as we do our best to get our people, enterprises, and industries back on their feet so that the engine of development can power our societies towards prosperity that actually leaves no one behind. Let me express the strong collective conviction of my country that the relevance, legitimacy, and moral authority of the United Nations will forever remain deficient, undermined by the absence of comprehensive reforms of the United Nations Security Council. We therefore remain firmly committed to reforming the Security Council to make it a more effective, representative, and democratic global institution. Given the magnitude and variety of challenges the world continues to confront, a more fit for purpose United Nations is urgently needed, one that possesses the legitimacy and efficacy in dealing with threats to international peace and security. A just and inclusive world order cannot be spearheaded by a United Nations Security Council that persistently and unjustly fails the inclusivity criterion. Similarly, threats to democracy will not be credibly resolved by an undemocratic and representative Security Council. It is vitally important for this critical institution to reflect the values it is entrusted to protect, to defend, to uphold on behalf of humankind. We welcome the call by President Biden this morning for the expansion of the membership of the Security Council as a significant step in the right direction, and we look forward to building consensus for the actualization of the same.
U.S. President Biden's recent call for this UN family to defend the rights of smaller nations as equals of larger ones must not only be applauded, it must be uploaded. As African member states, we do not wish to gather here next year with no progress made on the African Union's Zuluan consensus, which demands that 2 permanent seats with veto power and 5 non-permanent seats must go to Africa. So, following the strong signal of support from the U.S. government, we expect to see this matter on its way to the United Nations Security Council to be tabled, to be heard, and to be settled. That is the UN we want. That is the UN the world needs. A reformed UN that practices the equality and democracy it preaches. A reformed UN that is not constantly polarized by nuclear power, stuck in Cold War mindsets. A reformed UN that uses its multilateral muscle to give equal attention to the interlocking issues of public health, food security, insecurity, climate change, and conflict, regardless of where they emerge or who they affect. A reformed UN that gives equal weight to all its members who give it meaning, not just those who give it money.
These conversations of calling for more inclusion, of more meaningful inclusion and representation of some African and Caribbean countries in United Nations multilateral institutions such as the Security Council is not new. I can trace it back as far as also at the time when Robert Mugabe was still president of Zimbabwe and Barack Obama was still in office in the United States of America. These issues were raised by the African Union, but nothing has changed. Nothing has been done to rectify these issues that have been raised. A lot of skeptics across the world have argued that this exercise is indeed a futile endeavor. They have cited that the United Nations was created at a time when the majority of these countries in Africa and the Caribbean that are seeking better representation in the United Nations multilateral institutions were not even countries or were not even independent at the time when the United Nations was created. I want to hear what you think in the comment section. Do you think it is really a futile endeavor for African and Caribbean countries to call for more meaningful engagement and representation in key United Nations multilateral institutions such as the Security Council? Please leave your thoughts in the comment section. I want to hear what you think. Until next time, this was The Take.